Characteristics and building blocks of life. Goals of this video. So we're answering the essential questions. What are the defining characteristics that make up the 5 kingdoms that we're going to talk about this year?
During this video specifically, we're going to be looking at what are the characteristic properties of life and what are the essential building blocks of life.
These are the characteristics of life. Number 1, all living organisms are made up of cells. Number 2, all living organisms acquire energy. Number 3, all living organisms grow and develop. Number 4, all living organisms reproduce. And last but not least, number 5, all living organisms respond to stimuli and adapt to their environment.
So the first characteristic of life is that all living things have cells. A cell is the most basic unit of life.
Some cells, such as bacterial cells, just have one cell, while other organisms, such as humans, have multiple cells, and they're made up of trillions of different cells. And cells come in all shapes and different sizes, and they all have different functions.
The second characteristic that all living things have is that all living things need to acquire energy in some way. One way that organisms can do this is that they can make their own energy. We call these types of organisms producers because they produce their own energy for themselves.
Another way organisms acquire energy is through consuming other organisms by eating them to acquire their energy that their bodies contain. We call these organisms consumers.
The last way that organisms can get their energy is by consuming things that are already dead. We call these types of organisms decomposers.
The third characteristic property we're going to talk about is all living organisms need to grow and develop, such as bacterial cells or unicellular organisms that are made up of just one cell. These cells acquire energy, they grow larger before they eventually divide.
In multicellular organisms, when they grow and develop, they're producing new cells. So when you grow and you're growing up, you're producing more skin cells, some more liver cells, some more brain cells, all to accommodate your larger size.
The fourth characteristic of living things we're going to talk about is that all living things need to reproduce and divide. They need to do this in order to ensure that their species will live on. So in order to have more individuals in your species, you need to reproduce.
There's 2 different ways that reproduction happens in living things on Earth. The first way that we'll talk about is asexual reproduction. And asexual reproduction means that there's one parent that is essentially cloning itself to produce its offspring. The second way is sexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, there's 2 parents that produce one offspring.
The fifth characteristic of life we're going to talk about is that all living organisms need to respond to stimuli and adapt to their environment. Living organisms need to maintain homeostasis. So the outside environment may change, but the internal environment of the organism needs to remain constant, and that's what homeostasis is keeping your internal conditions constant. If you look at the picture, the plant is responding to a stimuli, the light is shining on the plant, and the plant is actually growing towards the light, so it's responding to its environment.
Living things are made out of 4 essential ingredients. We call these the building blocks of life.
Number 1, proteins. Number 2, carbohydrates. Number 3, lipids. Number 4, nucleic acids.
So all living things are essentially made up of the same 4 different types of material. The first type of material is something that we call proteins. And proteins are made up of smaller pieces called amino acids. So the way this works is a lot like train cars make up a train. So in this analogy, the amino acids are like the train car, and the protein is the train itself. So the smaller amino acids are what come together to make up the larger protein.
So people eat protein in their diet in order to break down the amino acids that the meat or cheese or other food contain, so they can use those amino acids to build their own proteins. And proteins are essential to life. Proteins basically carry out every function of the cell. They are basically the cell's workers. and they do everything for the cell.
The second building block or material that living things are made out of is something called carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made up of smaller units called sugars. So these smaller units, the sugars work in the same way that the amino acids worked in the protein. So smaller sugar molecules make up the larger carbohydrate.
So carbohydrates actually carry a large amount of energy, and in producers like plants, they use carbohydrates to store energy. Consumers like ourselves, we actually eat these plants to break down their carbohydrates that they store, and we use those carbohydrates as energy.
The third building block of material that living things are made out of is lipids. So lipids, some examples of lipids are fats and oils and waxes.
Lipids are also used to make up the cell membrane. The cell membrane is made up of a specific type of lipid called the phospholipid, and we'll look at that closer later on in the year. Lipids also store a large amount of energy. When you break down and eat food that contains energy, such as carbohydrates, you need a place to store that energy if you are consuming more energy than you're using. So you will actually store that energy in the form of fat.
And the last material or building block that living things are made out of is something called nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are made up of smaller units called nucleotides. These nucleotides work the same way as the train cars make up the train again, where smaller train cars make up the larger train. The smaller nucleotides make up the larger nucleic acids.
Two molecules that are made up of nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. DNA stands for deoxyribose nucleic acid, and RNA stands for ribose nucleic acid. These two materials are very important to life, and we'll talk about them more in depth when we get into the unit of DNA and cells.
So to recap, the essential question that we're working towards is what characteristics to make up the 5 kingdoms. So what makes those kingdoms unique? To start out, we talked about characteristics that all living things have in common. Those characteristics are:
Number 1, all living organisms are made up of cells. Number 2, all living organisms acquire energy. Number 3, all living organisms grow and develop. Number 4, all living organisms reproduce. And last but not least, number 5, all living organisms respond to stimuli and adapt to their environment.
We also talked about the material that makes up living things, or the essential building blocks. Those essential building blocks are:
Number 1, proteins. Number 2, carbohydrates. Number 3, lipids. Number 4, nucleic acids.